Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Pina de Silva, and I am the Vice President of Programs, Partnerships, and Impact at Ability Center, and I have the privilege of being the MC for this conference. On behalf of Ability Center and Allison Hector Alexander, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Region of Durham, we want to welcome everyone to our second Accessibility Conference in honor of 2023's National Accessibility Week. This year's theme is Power of Inclusion, moving accessibility from awareness to action. So before we begin, I'd like to start the conference by making a land acknowledgement and honoring the land and Indigenous presence that dates back thousands of years. I ask that you also take a moment to honor the lands upon which you are currently joining us from. We recognize and honor the Mississauga people as the traditional stewards of the land on which we meet. We have a shared obligation to respect and sustain the lands, waters, and all living things. The dish with one spoon wampum belt, often associated to the Eternal Council Fire Belt, was used by Indigenous peoples of the Western Woodlands to describe an agreement for sharing hunting territory among the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. We all share a single dish, Mother Earth. All people sharing the territory are expected to limit the resources they take, leaving enough for others now as well as those in the future. So I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping in terms of the processes and some of the accessibility guidelines. We will have a keynote speaker in today's conference, followed by 3 panelists. There will be a Q&A session following the last panelist. Questions will be collected through the Q&A icon, which is located at the bottom of the screen, which can be accessed by clicking on it or tabbing over to the 4th icon from the left to enter your questions. Please feel free to type in any questions you have throughout the presentation into that Q&A icon. We will gather the questions as they are coming in and do our best to get them all answered during the Q&A session with the speakers. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please indicate their name right in your question. If you're not able to type into the Q&A box, then please raise your hand during the Q&A session using the icon on the bottom screen, or click Alt-Y, as in the letter Y, for the shortcut, and Marta will unmute you so that you can ask your question. We do ask that you wait until the Q&A session to raise your hand. There is an ASL interpreter on the screen, and CART closed captioning is turned on. If you do not see the interpreter or the closed captioning, please email Marta Sheverdovich and her for technical support, and her email address is on the PowerPoint there. So again, thank you for joining us for our conference, Disability Inclusion. So disability inclusion refers to including people with disabilities in everyday activities. Specifically for this year's conference, it refers to people with disabilities having similar roles in a place of employment to their peers who do not have a disability. In Canada, more than 6.2 million Canadians live with some form of a disability. That is 22% of the Canadian population. We know that when a business hires an employee with a disability, they get an employee and colleague who has a 72% higher retention rate and 90% average to better job performance. Additionally, 62% of Canadians would be more likely to do business with a company if they knew the business had specific policies to support employees who have a disability. And yet, despite these facts, only 59% of working age Canadians who have a disability are employed, compared to 80% of the general population. That's an employment gap of 21%. We know that disability community is an untapped labor market where some of our most skilled, educated, and innovative employees are waiting to be hired. Sometimes as employers, we think that accommodations will be expensive and will require us purchasing specialized equipment or retrofitting a space. But accommodations can be as simple as working from home, as modifying and having different duties, as providing some communication aids. It can be as simple as having a special chair or back support. It does not have to cost a significant amount of money to put accommodations into place. So now that I've laid down some of the foundation in terms of stats and related to disability and the labor market, I would like to start the conference by introducing our keynote speaker, Tim Rose. After Tim, we will have 3 panelists speak on their experience, I will introduce the panelists after Tim has finished with his keynote. Tim Rose, a senior accessibility consultant with CIBC, is a game changer, is a change maker and a business leader who was fortunate enough to be born with a significant physical disability. Raised to push the envelope, Tim has had the privilege of living, working, and studying on 3 continents, which has given him the opportunity to view disability through the lens of many cultures. Tim has been a proud member of CIBC since 2017, holding a variety of roles, including compliance, community investment, and now client experience, where he helps lead the bank's Accessibility Center of Excellence. Tim, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Real. Okay, now we're being recorded. That is very real and was very real for me. I knew those statistics coming out of school, the 59% versus 80%. But with my advanced degrees, I was quite confident that I wasn't going to be one of those numbers. But as it turns out, I was. And no matter how much networking or job applying I did, I was getting nothing but no's. I even started my own charity at the time, trying to put myself out there in a way that people couldn't say no to me, but they still could say no. And for about 4 or 5 years, I was left on provincial disability pension, not really knowing what I was going to do, and trying to pick up any little bit of part-time work I could, even stuff that was way below my education and skill set, just so I could get a foothold in the job market. And then I had a realization. And that realization is what really started me on my career journey that I'm on now. And the realization was quite simple. I knew that my disability was a massive advantage. I knew that it gave me a lens on the world that very few people get to have. I knew that my disability gave me skills by virtue of having to be creative, having to be adaptable, having to be resilient, that companies would absolutely love. All I had to do was figure out a way to show them that. And so I ended up starting my own consulting firm called Disability Positive Consulting, which was focused on this idea of demonstrating to companies, to individuals, to government organizations, the asset that is inherent in disability. And so I became my own boss, and I started doing speaking engagements like this one here today. I started doing individual consulting projects, and I started meeting with a number of stakeholders and influencers around Toronto and around Ontario to try and build the disability positive brand. And it was out of that work that my career really, really took off. It started back in 2015 or 16, when I got offered opportunities to work in the employment and disability space with an organization called Magnet, which was based out of what is now Toronto Metropolitan University. And after Magnet, there was a number of other smaller consulting engagements. And then came my big break. And my big break came when Magnet, my employer at the time, was sponsored in a diversity-related project by the bank CIBC. And so I was meeting with senior leaders from CIBC. And one of those senior leaders, who has since become my mentor and very close friend, looked at me across the table at one of these meetings and said, Tim, what would it take for you to come to this side of the table? And my answer was, not much. So I ended up getting connected with some amazing people at CIBC who really supported my career and helped it take off. And I joined where I am now in 2017. And I go through my career journey not to pat myself on the back, not to say, oh, I did everything right, because I certainly didn't, but to illustrate that no matter how hard it is for people with disabilities, no matter how challenging it can be to put yourself out there in a world that isn't set up for you, the number one superpower we all have as people with disabilities in this world is we get to see the world through a lens that very few people do. And that is a really, really powerful thing. And if you find a way, as I did, to harness that, you will put yourself in a position to succeed. And I'll talk a little bit about how I've harnessed that and some of the lessons I've learned along the way as I go through here. First and foremost, so I joined CIBC in 2017, and I never in a million years thought I would work at a bank. I'm a fairly radical left-wing socialist, so the fact that I work at a bank still amuses me to no end. But I do. And I started at the bank in regulatory compliance. And in that role, on about the third day, they handed me this file that was called accessibility. And they were like, hey, Tim, you know this stuff, you figure it out. What do we need to do for accessibility? And there is no way that a junior compliance officer should have been given a project of that magnitude. But because of my disability and because of my lived experience, they knew I had the skills, right? So that's one of the ways that my disability is a huge asset, is that I have experiences that none of my colleagues did. And I was able to get in on projects early. And from there, I moved into community investment, helping the bank really show up in the persons with disabilities community in a meaningful way. And doing so not by giving to the same charities that most organizations give to. And don't get me wrong, those charities are important. So anyone who's from one of those charities in the audience today, please understand, you should get all the money in the world. I just mean that I wanted us as a bank to be innovative in this space and to really connect to the community. And I was able to do that through a number of initiatives, which I can talk a little bit about more if anyone's interested during the Q&A period. And then I moved into the role I'm in now. And this is where I was meant to be all along. So I'm now working in our client experience team, helping make the bank more accessible for all of our clients across the country, the thousands and thousands of clients we have who have a disability, or their families, or their friends. As I said right at the beginning of my presentation, the support network is super important. And so in that role, I do a number of things. I do everything from training of individuals in our bank to be more disability aware. I oversee all the regulations and laws. I consult with our product teams on how to make our products more accessible. And most important, I get to deal with our clients directly, one-on-one, who are having challenges in their banking because of a disability. And I try and help them find solutions to make our bank more accessible. And I work with our teams across the organization. And all of these things go back to the fact that my disability is a huge advantage. In fact, the biggest advantage in my career, because all of these roles would not have happened without that lived experience, or at least they would have happened very differently. And I feel like I've been able to, through my career, demonstrate the power of unlocking the potential of disability. And so when we think about accommodations that were mentioned earlier, I don't want us to think of them as just accommodations. What they are, to me, are accelerations. So by accommodating someone with a disability, you're not only accelerating their progress, their ability to maximize their potential, as someone did for me many years ago. You are accelerating the organization by including more people with disabilities and accommodating them appropriately. And that is what every company in corporate Canada, and I can say this from the inside, is looking to do. We're all looking to accelerate. We're all looking to really make a difference for our clients, our customers, whatever industry that is, and also to maximize profits. Business is business, right? But all of that, the profit, the doing the right thing, all of that will be greatly accelerated if we as a society tap in to the innovation of people with disabilities. And I am living proof of that. I never thought that I would now be in my 6th year at a bank, helping to transform an organization into one that truly understands accessibility, truly understands people with disabilities, and really wants to focus on that acceleration. And that has been the highlight of my career so far. And it's a career that I sincerely hope won't be stopping, ending anytime soon. So I'm going to wrap up in a moment, but I'd just like to say that I hope you took from my story that even though it can take a few years, you can find that path. And what you need is catalysts like I had, but you also need belief in yourself. Because if it hadn't been for the resilience that I had for those years that I was struggling, I don't know where I'd be today. Thank you for having me at today's conference. Thank you to the Ability Center for putting this on. And once again, I'd like to wish everyone an absolutely incredible National Accessibility Week as Canada strives to be a truly barrier-free country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was a wonderful way to kickstart the conference. Really loved the concept of, as you said, disability is a major advantage. That I believe you used the word superpower, that is your superpower. And because you're, as an individual with a disability, able to see the world through a lens that others can't. And that in itself is a superpower and something that companies can really use to accelerate and maximize their profits. So for all of the businesses and employers who are on this call and listening to that, I think that's an amazing and very, very valuable piece of information for us to take away. Okay, so moving on, I'm gonna go through and introduce the panelists in the order that they will be speaking. So first, we have Pina Dentino, who is the founder of Aquam Global Access Incorporated, an inclusion and accessibility professional network that helps build disability inclusion, awareness, and accessibility confidence across organizations through strong leadership and action-driven plans. Pina holds a master's degree in inclusive design. Her work with large private organizations, municipalities, provincial and federal government has contributed to her ability to work with all levels of management, in particular the C-suite. She is a strong advocate for disability rights and inclusion, always amplifying the voice of equity-seeking groups, including people with disabilities, through active engagement and ensuring that their voices or our voices are heard during decision-making, going far beyond standards and regulations. Then we will have Sophie Lemieux, who is manager for people and talent management at Fable. She strives to create a culture of belonging and inclusion at Fable that starts with the recruitment process and extends into day-to-day operations. She works proactively to ensure diversity is reflected in all aspects of business, from hiring new talent to developing internal policies and procedures. Sophie has over 7 years of expertise in people leadership, having held successful people, talent, and employee engagement positions. Her studies in organizational behavior further informs her capacity to build teams and processes designed to support organizational growth. Most importantly, she herself is disabled and brings a unique perspective on how to best support inclusion across the company. And the third panelist we've got will be Glenda Watson. Motivated by her personal experience and the continual flow of social injustices faced by others living with communication disabilities, Glenda is a formidable voice for this systematically overlooked and devalued segment of our society. Through various projects and committees, she aims to increase awareness, understanding, and inclusion of people who use alternative means of communication. Currently, Glenda is working on her Master of Applied Science in Mechanical and Materials Engineering at Queen's University. Her thesis research centers around developing a universal design strategy to promote equity in employing people with communication disabilities. She is also contributing to the project developing recommendations and guidelines for augmentative and alternative communication to enable persons with motor and communication and speech impairments to participate in employment, which is funded by Advancing Accessibility Standards Research and the Government of Canada. Okay, so I'm going to hand the mic over to Pina, and she will kickstart the panel discussions.
Good morning, everyone, and happy National Accessibility Week. Thank you, Abilities, for inviting me to this incredible conference. It's been my second contribution, and I look forward to many more. You know, every time I join these events, I'm always surrounded with incredible friends, and you know, I know Tim, we go back a little bit through the Magnet Days, so congratulations, Tim, for your excellent work that you're doing at CIBC, as well as I think Sophie, we probably ran into each other just last week. So you know, it's such a small world in accessibility, and we all are together to sort of help one another raise the bar, but also achieve great things. So thank you all for that support. So a little bit about my story, which is somewhat a little different than Tim's, in the sense that I acquired a disability later in my life, but more so at the peak of my career, when I was actually excelling very quickly into a leadership role, into kind of that leadership circle. And as a result of losing my sight very quickly, actually happening sort of an overnight kind of complication to some surgery I had, I suddenly found myself blind, totally blind. And it was almost like putting an absolute brake on my life, not just my career, but also my life. All of a sudden, you know, you're home, you're trying to adjust to a new world, living with a disability, not really knowing what's ahead of you, dealing with, you know, young children. I was at the time a single mom. And, you know, when we look at the side of my work experience, as I said before, it felt like all my colleagues could see or would see was the disability. All of a sudden, they had forgotten what I was capable of doing and what, you know, all the contributions that I had made in that company at the time, also a bank, ironically enough, and you know what my career aspirations were. So I found myself in a situation where I had to retool myself, find a purpose, and saw this as an opportunity to not just, you know, help myself overcome this situation, but also learn about others who were in similar situation and trying to get further ahead in their career. So I began by speaking to some of the colleagues at the bank that had been there for a long time and try to understand where they were at and what their experiences were. And what I learned at the time was that many individuals with disabilities at the bank seemed to all be stuck in the same place. They were doing the same job. They felt grateful that they had a job because they had a disability. They felt that they didn't want to rock the boat because if they spoke too loudly about some of the challenges and the barriers, that might negatively impact their careers or their jobs, or even so far at getting fired. And of course, they didn't want that. And they really felt that they didn't have any power to affect any change. And I felt that this could not go on. Just felt really that this was a great opportunity for myself at being in a leadership role to sort of amplify their voice, amplify the voice of those individuals who had been there and really struggling through years and years of challenges and barriers and struggles. And I wanted to make a change. And I so started promoting accessibility at the bank and working with some of the leadership groups and gradually basically crafted that job of accessibility leadership within the bank. And so for 16 years, I worked on that portfolio, developing a team of leaders within the bank, and also working with other banks like CIBC and the Royal and all the others to start talking about accessibility within the industry, not just within the company that I worked with, but also within the industry. And how could we make banking or access to financial services more accessible for everyone? And I think that from that perspective, my goal has always been to try and address those systemic issues such as cultural barriers, because I felt that one of the things that held people back was not their ability to do the work or be productive. People with disabilities are very innovative. We are very creative. We are always resolving conflicts. We're always challenged and finding ways to overcome this. But the biggest barrier was cultural, and people really, you know, made assumptions on disability. So people with disabilities could not work well, or people with disabilities needed a lot of accommodation, or people with disability, you know, you couldn't fire a person who had a disability if they were not productive. So we spent a lot of time demystifying some of those myths and trying to educate people. The other part was also educating and upskilling our people with disabilities that were within our environments and giving them opportunities to learn and to try different things. And so pairing them with coaches and pairing them with mentors. As Tim said, it's very difficult to move up the ladder or even within the career within your career, if you don't have mentors. And I think it's very important to try and find those mentors within the organization. and it doesn't have to be within the organization. It could be within your surrounding. So a lot of us have mentors outside of work who help us stay positive and who help us achieve those extra levels or higher levels. So, use those mentors, use the feedback that you're receiving and the support that you're receiving from those coaches and mentors to help you out. But in the workplace, pairing a person with a disability with a mentor made it possible for those individuals to learn how to navigate the systems, to have those conversations with different people. And I think that was really important. The other thing that we had to work very hard at is also amplifying the value of accessibility. People really felt that accessibility was only for them, only for those people with disabilities. They didn't understand that accessibility actually benefited everyone, even though many examples stood in front of their own faces, as one would say, or at the tip of their fingers. But for whatever reason, there's always an assumption that, we're doing this for only a small group of people, and it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time, so why are we doing this? And so just working on trying to demystify these was one of the challenges we had. So coming up with ways that people understood accessibility better, understood the value of disability and inclusion, understood that you can actually accommodate people, not based on your assumptions and your myth, but by listening to them and allowing them to tell you what they need, or allowing us to voice what it is that we need rather than you telling us what we need to do the job better. Also allowing us to articulate where we want to go in our careers and how we want to get there. That's absolutely imperative if you want to feel and create an inclusive environment. All of that work led me to doing I actually left the bank after 30 years and started my own consulting company in 2016. And the goal of my company was really, as we said in the introduction, was to help businesses understand those accessibility better and demystify, but also help them create accessibility plans and strategies that are meaningful, that they're not driven simply by the law, but they're driven by lived experience and the voice of persons with disabilities. So just to wrap it up for now, what that led me to is becoming also a co-advisor to the Employment Social Development Services and Minister Qualtrough to develop what we call a disability inclusion business network, and basically framed a little bit on something that I started years ago, which is really trying to bring businesses together as peer-to-peer to help each other understand what those challenges are when we talk about accessibility and disability inclusion, and to work together to build resources, to work together to build best practices so that they can support one another. So creating events, creating career processes that can help people with disabilities not only work in one company, for instance, but within an entire industry, or build or upskill in a way that their skills can be transportable across different jobs and opportunities. So that's sort of the high level view of what we want to do with the business, the Disability Inclusion Business Network. And we want to bring those individuals and the businesses together, not only for large businesses, because we have a tendency to think about large businesses, but also recognize that in our country, 97 to 99%, depending on what numbers you look at, of businesses are small to medium businesses. And businesses need help. Businesses need support to engage with persons with disabilities. We find that the smaller businesses are even way more resilient and sometimes even more willing to hire persons with disabilities, because their focus is on hiring people based on functions, not necessarily looking at certificates or looking at diplomas, but really understanding what it is that they want the individual to do, and understanding what the individual can do, even if it is done in a different way. So some of the focus that we're going to be looking at is how do we continue to change the dialogue on disability inclusion so that people with disabilities have the best advantage, opportunities, and aspirations to move along the career path, but also help business understand how all this work can actually improve their customer and employee services across their organization. So I'm going to pause here for now and let our other speakers take on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Pina. That was some great, insightful information there. I love the concept that you mentioned at the end, that we really have to change the dialogue, and that everyone is responsible for helping to change that dialogue. And, you know, the whole concept that it's not just about going to the table with the larger businesses, but the small to medium-sized businesses also need to come together if we're going to be looking to break down a lot of those cultural barriers, those assumptions that employers make or communities make around the ability of individuals with disabilities to be able to participate in the labor market or in our communities overall, right? That those cultural barriers and the assumptions have to be broken down. Absolutely. Okay, so moving right along, I'm going to pass the mic over to Sophie now.
Hello, everyone. Happy Accessibility Awareness Week. I promise I'm not going to be making this boring with my little PowerPoint, but I'm Sophie, and I'm speaking a little bit about my experience, but as well as the company that I work for, which is Fable. And our goal at Fable is to make disability inclusion practices go beyond compliance into awareness, inclusion, and a way that is truly inclusive, even for the people that are not directly concerned. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how do we move from compliance to true inclusion? How do we avoid biases when it comes to hiring people with disabilities, as well as we've just talked about promoting people with disabilities, making sure they have a seat at the table, and then the types of systems, processes, and data that we use internally to make these decisions. I think before I start diving into these strategies, a little bit about myself. We've had this introduction at the start, but I am myself disabled. I had a traumatic brain injury that was very severe, that impacted my brain, obviously my vision as well. And I also am autistic. The types of disabilities that I have are not visible. So it was a personal choice that I made not too far away. I was actually a little bit established in my career when I decided to disclose my disability. And that's kind of when I started working in the field of disability and inclusion, because I saw the changes and the shifts in how people were treating me and where I started being invited, but mostly where I started not being invited because I had disclosed my disability. That was something that I found to be really sad, to be honest. And this is kind of why I'm pushing a lot on this work to really center the voices of people with disabilities. Do I have? No, okay. So as I said, our goal at Fable through everything that we do is to move from compliance to something that is truly inclusive. In terms of what do I mean by compliance? For compliance, it would be, following the laws. So prohibition of clear discrimination, following a reasonable accommodations process, providing non-discrimination training, and adhering to equal opportunity laws. These are all great, and I love that companies are doing that. It gives us a starting point. My goal is to see companies being truly inclusive, which means proactively seeking out and engaging candidates with disabilities, not just through the hiring process, but connecting with them, having them understand the voice of our company, hearing feedback about how are we doing, what are we doing, do you want to work here? And if we are hearing from people with disabilities, they want to work with us, I think we're doing a good job. From there, it's having this constant communication and back and forth of, is this process inclusive? Or is it making sense? And getting that feedback and acting on it. At Fable, we also provide opportunities for flexible interviews. This is to everyone. It's not a form for accommodations. People don't need to disclose. They don't need to have any reason. We don't care what the reason is for someone to ask a different form of interview. So for example, we offer different types. Some of them would be a written interview for the first screen because we know how nerve-wracking a first interview is. And with this type of form, we can be sure that we are focusing on the content and not how the content is delivered, is the person getting the message, and all of these things. We also try, and I say we do this, I think 90% of the time, to provide the entire guideline of the interview process and what our expectations are. So this means if you're at the second interview with the hiring manager, you should know what you will be asked, what will be discussed, and what you should focus on as the candidate. And then we also, once people are within the onboarding process, try to make the onboarding and the hiring process really as flexible as possible. And that's through the entire cycle of employment, to make sure, again, that people don't have to disclose anything if they're not comfortable disclosing. People can request accommodations, even if they don't have, for example, a formal diagnosis. We know how those can be difficult for some types of disabilities, and just to make it a safe environment where people are able to be their best selves at work. I think this has to go in conjunction as well with a lot of training for managers and leadership as to this is what accommodations look like. And what we mean by not needing a necessary disclosure process doesn't mean we don't want to hear it. It means we want people to be able to feel safe disclosing their needs without us needing their entire medical background history, because that is personal information that people shouldn't have to share if they don't want to, but if they do, they can. I'll go to the next slide. And in terms of in hiring, one of the key things that we are constantly working on is avoiding bias. We're all biased, right? Implicit biases are just common in human nature. It's a way for us to be able to actually do things, make decisions. It has an evolutionary root. It makes us make better decisions. And what we have to do for that is to really be aware that biases exist. Try to see, okay, where are my biases coming in, and be able to have these conversations. I know I don't pronounce that word correctly. I'm French. I try. I really try. But what I want to not hear, so when I'm having conversations with hiring managers, is, oh, I get a good vibe from this person, or I have a bad or good gut feeling. I mean, trust your gut feeling for most things in your life. I think that is good. Don't if you're a hiring manager, because our tendency as hiring managers or people within the hiring process will be to either hire people that we feel are similar to us, which is not what we need to make a good team. We might also be looking to hire people that resemble other people that we know, which is not necessarily, again, the thing that we want to do when building a team. Our goal when building a good team to have the best types of innovation is to have different caliber of people. Obviously, our goal is to have high caliber of people, but people will have a different experience, a different lived experience, a different set of skill set. And our goal, my goal personally, anytime I'm in conversations with people, is to really challenge these thought processes so that we are always focusing on core competencies. Can a person do the job? Yes. Okay. It doesn't really matter if you would grab a beer with them. You probably will. You probably will end up grabbing a beer with them at some point. And the way that they behaved in an interview is not an indicator of that. Another thing I want to avoid hearing is something like, I've heard great things about them. That's not a bad thing. Obviously, if you have a good reputation within the industry, it's good, but we don't want people to be prioritized because of the ties that they have. Everyone has to start somewhere. And our goal, again, is to be able to bring people that have a different background, a different perspective. And so these are some questions. I'm sharing this. I know that we have different types of people in the group listening today, but I'm just sharing this in terms of both as a candidate or if you're part of a hiring team. These are the types of questions that we ask ourselves at Fable. Does this applicant remind me of myself or someone I know? And then if we have that lens and that experience, we're able to then question our train of thought as to, okay, am I making a decision based on this resemblance? Are there elements in this resume, such as format or style, that positively or negatively influence my overall impression? The goal to this answer is to hear no. A resume is a piece of paper. Some people will not have the formal training as to what is an appropriate resume. It doesn't really matter. It's not an indicator of the role unless we are hiring for a resume copywriter, which, I mean, in that case, yeah, it should probably influence the impression of the person. But otherwise, it really has to be a focus on core competencies to be able to make a hiring decision that is inclusive. And then really seeing, okay, are there any elements to this resume that I'm considering that are not relevant to the job, but could still be good? And this is a way to be able to prioritize people, again, that might have different lived experiences. So to give an example, Fable, we're a tech company. And if we are looking for people with disabilities that have specific experience, let's say we were looking for what other tech companies could be looking for, which is 4 to 5 years experience in tech. And then we're looking for someone with a disability because we want to have a diverse team. And we'd like someone to have a different lived experience, but still have the exact prerequisite that we have in our head of this person that we know. We're probably not going to find this person. We have to be able to be more open-minded as to, can this person do the job? Have they represented on their resume or through our conversations that they have skills and core competencies that are directly relevant to this role, even if they have not done this job before? Have they shown that they are creative? Have they shown that they are innovative? Do I feel like they can problem solve easily? And if these answers are yes, usually it will be someone who will get on the job and really have a positive impact and show up and rise up. And from my experience, those are kind of the best hires that we've made, when on paper it didn't necessarily make exact sense, but there was all of these points that actually made it make a lot more sense. And so just making sure that we are evaluating core competencies of people, the actual experience listed on the resume, not kind of what our assumptions about that are on all of the aspects, and just making sure that if we have any internal norms that the person is not following because they don't know that we have those norms, we're not holding people accountable to that. I think it's really important in any decision of hiring, promoting, making space for people with different lived experiences, that we are actually making space for their lived experience, so that we're removing our lens from it. We're just there as a spectator, taking it all in and trying to make the most objective decision possible. I think we can go to the next slide. So providing equitable opportunities for advancement, because it's one thing to get people with disabilities in, which is already something that we are struggling in terms of numbers in Canada. But then again, number of people with disabilities in leadership positions, I think we're at under 2%. It's not good. We have a lot of work to do. And I mean, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to hiring people with disabilities, but then it's promoting us, making opportunities for us for advancement. We've demonstrated that we can do the job. We are flexible, we are adaptable, and then there usually will be this type of stagnation in the role where why isn't there any movement? So for us at Fable, what we look at is ensuring that our tools are accessible. Any type of tool that we use internally, whether it be our chatting app, where we do project management, where we do emails, and all of these tools that are internal that help us be productive at work, they have to be accessible so that people can use them, because they will be evaluated on their usage of it. Providing disability inclusion training to leadership, to people on the team, because we want to know, okay, how do we make room for people at the table? And through this training, it should always come from a lens of someone with that lived experience. And then providing equitable, not equal access to developmental opportunities. This is a large conversation that we have internally, where it's really about making sure that people have an equitable access. If we're not all starting from the same space, I just don't think there's fairness in providing the exact same opportunity for people. I think it should really be adapted and targeted to people's lived experience and needs. And then again, accommodating individual needs is a really important form. And for us internally at Fable, accommodations are not part of a standard medical process. We don't need any of that documentation. We believe, obviously, as the design principle, that accessibility benefits everybody, and that goes into our people principles as well. We always try to recognize and celebrate achievements for everyone publicly, and this is kind of maybe the little tip that I would give for people is just really don't be afraid to show up and be proud of what you've accomplished and just talk about it internally. That really helps. And then having really clear communication channels and clear performance objectives that are, again, evaluated by our internal team. We always involve people with disabilities, whether it be our testers or our team directly or both, through these types of processes to make sure that they feel it's inclusive, because it doesn't really matter if I feel it's inclusive, to be honest, or if our leaders think it's inclusive. It has to be something that everyone feels they can use and move forward with. And we can go to the next slide, which I'll do like really fast in 2 minutes. So final slide before we'll go to the questions is for accessible tooling. So I talked a little bit about that before. If you are a person with disability, you might be aware that a lot of the websites and tools are not fully accessible. And this is a challenge when it comes to building processes for people and for internal advancement. And so for us, I just want to share a little bit as to how I went to go about what tools we are using. As I said, we have to make sure that our tools are all accessible. This was not an easy task or a fun task. I think we tested 40 applicant tracking systems. And I'm not sharing the one that we are using publicly because, to be honest, it's not fully accessible. It was the best of the options, but there is work to be done. And it is the same thing about HRIS, our human resources information system, where all the information is, whereas the applicant tracking system is where people apply. But what we had as a process to make sure that we were able to implement these for the size of our team was we did a thorough testing first. So just a lot of reviewing. Do they have any standards of accessibility? Do they have a section on WCAG standards or accessibility on their websites? Majority did not. Then speaking to the team, and then we would involve our testers internally really early to test the platforms, people that use specific types of assistive technology. We wanted all types of experiences to be represented through the testing process. And so involving them in the user testing and then regularly testing the system, because sometimes there will be updates to the systems that remove accessibility features. And so I think this is one of the parts where people in the people team or people management side of things, there's a lot of work to be done in advocating that this is a need. Like, we need these to be accessible yesterday. And if you are wanting to apply somewhere or participate in the process, just to be able to advocate for that and participate in the experience, I think would be a really good opportunity for someone to showcase their strength. And we'll talk again in the question section.
Thanks, Sophie. That was wonderful. Some great concrete actions and ideas that we can all take away with us. So I love that. The whole concept of compliance versus inclusion, compliance, we've often said, really becomes a checkbox exercise, and we certainly don't want accessibility and inclusion to be a checkbox exercise. It's truly a journey that we are all on together. So thank you for the great presentation. I'm going to hand now the mic over to Glenda, who will be our last panelist.
Good morning. I'm Glenda Watson Hyatt, zooming in from Surrey, British Columbia, where I am privileged to live, work, and play on the stolen, ancestral territory of the Kwantlen, Katsi, and Semiahmoo peoples. Today, I welcome the opportunity to share my master's research, Equity in Communication, Accommodating People with Speech Disabilities, in the Workplace. Imagine you are advancing as planned in your chosen career, when an injury or illness leaves you unable to verbally communicate as you do today. Your other abilities, skills, and knowledge remain intact. Does your employer accommodate you on your current advancement track, or create another position for you, better suited to your diminished verbal communication ability, but beneath your expertise, and at a lower pay grade? Next slide, please. Or do you become another Canadian with a disability, facing an unemployment rate of 51%? That rate is as high as 86% for people with speech disabilities. In comparison, 21% of Canadians without disabilities are unemployed. Next slide, please. To help define the population of people with speech disabilities, the American Speech Language Hearing Association defines a speech disorder as an impairment of the articulation of speech sounds, fluency, and/or voice. Next slide, please. To provide further context about this segment of the disabled community, the prevalence of speech disability in Canadian adults 15 years old or older is 1.9%. That is nearly 4 times the number of Canadians living with a developmental disability. Admittedly, these statistics are more than 15 years old, because the Participation in Activity Limitation Survey 2006 was the last census that included questions related to speech disability. The newer Canadian Survey on Disability includes communication questions only related to hearing. Some speech disabilities occur early in life, such as with cerebral palsy or autism spectrum disorder, while others are acquired later in life, such as after a stroke, or with multiple sclerosis, or oral cancers. Next slide, please. To put familiar faces to this population, consider these 2 individuals. Actor Val Kilmer had throat cancer, and treatment permanently damaged his voice, which has affected his ability to speak more than a few hoarse words at a time. In his most recent film, Top Gun: Maverick, the creators included his character and accommodated his speech disability. For those of you who have yet to see the movie, I won't spoil it by sharing how the creators achieved this. The late theoretical physicist, Stephen Hawking, was unable to communicate verbally due to ALS. He accessed a speech-generating device via a cheek switch mounted on his eyeglasses to deliver his lectures and to write emails, academic papers, and books. Next slide, please. I also identify with this population. My cerebral palsy affects my speech. I use multiple methods to communicate, including light tech communication boards, email, and text, the text-to-speech Proloquo 4 text app on my iPad, which I am currently using, and my own speech with individuals who are familiar with my unique dialect, Glenda-ish. Next slide, please. Unique barriers to employment may leave this group financially dependent, socially isolated, and personally unfulfilled. Next slide, please. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, signed and ratified by Canada, recognizes communication as a human right. We all know that people with mobility disabilities have a right to physical access within the built environment, and, in the same way, people with speech disabilities must have communication access, the means, supports, and opportunities to communicate effectively. Next slide, please. Both the Employment Equity Act of 1995 and the recently enacted Accessible Canada Act, ACA, aim to identify and remove barriers in employment. To comply with the ACA, employers will need to adapt in recruiting, retaining, and promoting Canadians with disabilities, including those with speech disabilities, by January 1st, 2040. Next slide, please. Universal design is a proactive mindset approach, benefiting all in the workplace and decreasing the need for individualized accommodations for employees with disabilities. Further research is needed to consider how communication access can be extended to a universal design approach. For example, with online application forms, not requiring a phone number removes a barrier for many people with speech disabilities, as well as others for whom using the phone is not comfortable or convenient. Next slide, please. The overall objective of this research is to develop a universally designed strategy to enhance the processes of recruiting, retaining, and promoting individuals with speech disabilities. This research consists of 3 phases. Next slide, please. The first phase was to determine where we are now in terms of accommodating people with disabilities, including speech disabilities, within the federal government's labor force. On January 22, 2021, in response to recent social injustice events, the Privy Council Office of Canada, the department that supports the Prime Minister and Cabinet, issued a call to action on anti-racism, equity, and inclusion in the federal public service. 90 deputy heads responded by letter, detailing the action their organizations have taken to date. A sample of 29 letters was analyzed to determine actions undertaken to increase inclusion. It is important to view these letters as a snapshot in time, rather than as detailed reports of accessibility and inclusion initiatives undertaken. Also keep in mind that private and many public sector employers have been legally obligated to accommodate employees with disabilities up to the point of undue hardship for the past 26 years. Next slide, please. Initial analysis of these 29 letters shows that actions relevant to employees with disabilities include establishing accessibility champions, advisory committees, and employees with disabilities networks, creating accessibility action plans, reviewing policies, programs, and initiatives to identify systemic racism and barriers to accessibility and disability inclusion, piloting the Government of Canada's Workplace Accessibility Passport, and moving towards the yes by default approach to the accommodation process, committing to include universal accessible washrooms in their workplace retrofits, offering a medical exemption to the official languages training program for employees for whom learning an additional language would be problematic, and shifting to a virtual or remote work environment. Next slide, please. Moving on to phase 2, which addresses where we need to be. A team of researchers with diverse backgrounds at Queen's University conducted a systematic review to answer the research question, what are the barriers and facilitators to accommodations in the workplace for adults who use augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC? Next slide, please. This systematic review, which was recently published, revealed an extensive list of personal and environmental facilitators. In the personal realm, facilitators included education, work-related experience, and skills and knowledge. In the environmental realm, facilitators included products and technology, the built environment, and attitudes. Next slide, please. My research is focusing on the identified, actionable facilitators within the employer's purview, which include, for example, accessible workplaces, supportive environment that includes time required for alternative communication strategies, encouraging interactions and relationship building with colleagues. For example, when planning social engagements, such as going out for drinks after work, choose an accessible location. Acknowledging the skills of people who use AAC in the workplace. Increasing awareness of and experience with accommodations and knowledge of relevant legislation. Next slide, please. The third phase of this research involves curating the best practices in recruiting, hiring, and retaining people with speech disabilities. The project's interdisciplinary team includes master's and doctoral students from Queen's and Carleton universities. Our community partner is Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, CCRW, a national not-for-profit organization which offers a wide range of employment services that aim to bring together qualified candidates with disabilities and inclusive employers. Working with CCRW, we seek to collect and analyze the lived experiences of 10 to 15 people with speech disabilities to better understand the barriers that have existed and still exist for them within the employment setting. Next slide, please. Our research questions include: what are the gaps in current practices in recruiting, hiring, and retaining people with speech disabilities in Canada? What are the best practices in recruiting, hiring, and retaining people with speech disabilities in Canada? Next slide, please. Preliminary results indicate several actionable ways employers can be more inclusive. Increasing awareness and understanding of speech disabilities contributes to implementing accommodations. Placing communication assistants on par with sign language interpreters, especially during the interviewing and onboarding phases until co-workers and colleagues become familiar with the employee's communication methods. Creating a texting option during in-person meetings to allow for more inclusive participation and contribution. And allowing more time for communication in everything from the expectation of an immediate verbal answer to giving a presentation that's only allowed to be 5 minutes. Next slide, please. We will begin recruiting participants with speech disabilities in the next few weeks. Participants will need to be eligible to work in Canada, be at least 18 years old, be comfortable communicating in English, identify as having a speech disability, and working or have worked in either volunteer or paid competitive work. The semi-structured interview will be conducted either via the secure text messaging platform, Slack, or via Zoom, depending upon the participants' preferences in terms of communication methods. For more information about the study or for the eventual results, please feel free to email me at 21glwh@queensu.ca or follow b.lab on Twitter or Facebook. Next slide, please. More than 500,000 Canadian adults are living with speech disabilities. Developing a universal design strategy to promote equity in employing these individuals would tap into an underutilized labor pool. Increasing the employment rate of this segment of the disabled community could result in thousands of Canadians with speech disabilities being employed, increasing financial independence, meaningfully contributing to society, and, hence, improving their overall quality of life. Next slide, please. I'd like to acknowledge this research is funded by research grants from the Government of Canada's Accessibility Standards Canada and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. If you have any questions, I am happy to type brief responses in the chat box. For questions requiring more in-depth responses, feel free to email me at 21glwh@queensu.ca. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda, for that presentation. We're so inspired, and thank you so much for taking the time and for agreeing to be on the panel. We're so happy that you were able to join us, and we're looking forward to hearing more about the research and to your additional research work that you will do in the future. So thank you, and very happy to have been privileged to hear all that you have done. And we're hoping that the audience also enjoyed the information that you provided, but also will use it as an opportunity to create more inclusive spaces and to create more opportunities for people in the work world for people with disabilities. So we are now going to be going into our question and answer section. I'm not sure why they can't see me. But I think you can hear me. Okay, so we're going to be going into the question and answer section. And thank you to all those who have submitted questions online. We will be taking some of those questions, and also feel free to put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I don't think the raise hand feature will work. You can put your questions in the Q&A and we'll be happy to answer them. So at this time, we are going to go back to the panel. And we will begin with the first question. So the first question is, what do you do when your requests for accommodations are not taken seriously? And I see Sophie here. I don't know whether she wants to answer that one, but we'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't like that to be a question, but I definitely understand what to do when your requests are not taken seriously. I think the process to request accommodations should be directly with someone from a people team or an HR team, because unfortunately not all managers are tooled and equipped with understanding that need. And if they are not taken seriously by the people or the HR team, what I would recommend is escalating. So who do they report to? And then requesting that these be taken seriously in that context. Other options for that, it depends what the information that was provided in that accommodation form provides. So if there's any advice from a medical professional on your team that's already on there, you can't add that. But if you don't add that and you feel comfortable with having that information, you can have it added. What I mean by that is not having information as to what your disability is, but just bringing that stamp of approval and expertise from an external party that just says this person needs that. They don't need to state the reason, but just having that sometimes will be required on a compliance level. At that state, unless there is undue hardship that is established, they are required by law to provide accommodation. So if they're not being taken seriously and they continue not to be taken seriously, I would say this is more of a legal case at that stage because there is that requirement.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie. And in my excitement, I totally forgot to introduce myself, so you have no idea who is speaking with you. So my name is Patricia Hines. I'm the Manager, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with the Regional Municipality of Durham. The Region of Durham is very happy to be partnering with the Ability Center in hosting this conference. This is our second time in partnering with the Ability Center in hosting the conference, and we are very happy to be a part of it. So thank you so much for joining us. Our director, Alison Hector Alexander, is also on the line, and she will be joining in to say a few words very shortly. So going on into our next question, and please, any member of the panel may be able to answer. But I'd also like to make it known, and one of the members of our audience has also asked the question and has brought up the lack of diversity in the panel, and I'm just going to put that out there as is. So we do know that when we look at the panel, there doesn't seem to be many dimensions of diversity in the panel. And that is something that the Planning Committee did, in fact, take into consideration. We did attempt very furiously to broaden the dimensions of diversity and to include more persons with intersectionalities on the panel, just so that the stereotype around disabilities is not promoted. We know that there is a stereotype that, you know, people with disabilities are mainly white or mainly older or mainly this. But we also know that there are many people with different identities who live with a disabilities, people who are Black, people from the 2S LGBT community, people from every community live with disabilities. We did actually have a broader audience. We did have panelists from other backgrounds. However, a number of our panelists became ill, and we had to replace. And we have ended up with this group of very well-lived experts who are still able to share. So we are hoping that the information that is shared today is seen on a broader level. They have shared personal experiences, but these are also experiences that these are experiences of persons from different identities and different backgrounds. And with that, we'll go into our other question. How do we evoke change when no one at the top sees a problem with how things are currently being done? So how do we evoke change when the leadership is not pushing it forward? So
I'll take
Pina,
that.
I see like you want to take that one?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I do want to take that, but I also want to add to something you said earlier and the whole conversation around intersectionality. And I think it's so, so important. In my introduction, I spoke about the fact that when I started my journey, I spoke to a number of individuals across the company who were disabled, who had disabilities, and really didn't feel like they had a voice. And I think part of that is also very cultural, because there are a lot of cultures that see disability as something that is not a good thing, that is shameful, and that is a curse, and that still exists today. As much as we don't want to believe that, it does still exist. There are many cultures where people with disabilities are not valued, and so their voice is very faint, if they're at all. And I think it's really important to also recognize that in those situations, it's sometimes difficult to get those people to explain and to articulate what it is they need for an accommodation, or that they even need an accommodation for that matter. So, to recognize those differences, to have conversations like that, and to facilitate conversations with peers in those situations is very, very helpful. In many companies, we have a lot of affinity groups or employee resource groups, and we have often an employee resource group for persons with disabilities. And what I try to tell people is that the employee resource group for disability needs to be weaved in all the other employee resource groups as well, because disability affects everybody, in every culture, in every color, in every gender, in every age, and as well as young students, young children and students, all the way through your life cycle as you age, right? So to your point about having a diverse panel, you have to think of that as well. And sometimes it takes more than one table to have everybody at the table. So just be aware of that. I think it's really, really important. Your question on leadership, I think, is very important too. Of course, there are leaders who, are driven by different priorities, and our job really is to make sure that you find allies throughout the organization who can help amplify that voice, whether it is persons with disabilities or the employee resource groups, as I said before, or whether it is managers. Frequently, leaders don't buy into accessibility because they don't understand accessibility or don't understand the value of accessibility or disability inclusion. And so, I go back to that conversation about how do you speak to someone in a manner that resonates to them. If I'm speaking to someone who knows someone with a lived experience, they get it. If I speak to someone in business, I need to speak to them in business terms, and I need to let them know, listen, you're leaving a quarter of your customers out there unserved. Do you really want to do that? And sometimes it is about compliance as well. Sophie talked about that, and sometimes that's what resonates with them. So those are tools. These are tools that you can use to help the leadership come on board. But more importantly, I think that more and more companies recognize now that accessibility has to be embedded in their fabric. And the more we move persons with disabilities into executive roles, into senior roles, the easier it will be for leadership to get it. So I think, you know, we need to look at all the different opportunities we have to amplify that knowledge, awareness, and influence.
Thank you, Pina. Thank you so much. I wonder whether Tim or Glenda wanted to add anything to that response.
Yeah, it's Tim speaking. I'll jump in a little bit here. I'll start off by saying that, you know, for me, as someone with a disability who's trying to climb within an organization in corporate Canada, I have my sights set on the C-suite, right? Like, I think
right.
there's a certain amount of ambition here that needs to come from within the disability community, that we deserve to be at those senior tables. And I'll throw it up there, because the more I say it, the more it's going to come true. My goal is to become CIBC's first ever CAO, or Chief Accessibility Officer, which is a role that doesn't exist yet, but sorely needs to. And so, you know, that's where I have my sights set, to be blunt. But the thing I wanted to build on with Pina's answer is, you know, often what it takes too is embedding accessibility in stuff that they understand. And I'll give an example. So a few years ago, CIBC came out with a new purpose statement, what our purpose was as a bank, which is to help make our clients' ambitions a reality. And I went to our executive and I said, that's great, but I'm reading in the second half of that sentence, which is help make our clients' ambitions a reality in an accessible way. And as soon as I put it in their purpose line, like as soon as I embedded it in their kind of corporate buzzword slogan thing, they're like, oh, that makes sense, right? So it's using the language that they're already using and putting accessibility and diversity language in that, so that we as an organization can excel.
Thank you, Tim. And I believe that that's a really good place to go, because some organizations have this fear, you know, that they have to change the whole world, instead of just making it a part of the culture, a part of what the organization does. And it does, starting with the leadership, leading by example, is really a good model for any organization when it comes to accessibility or anything inclusive for the organization. Glenda, did you want to add anything? Your microphone is not on, Glenda. Can we unmute her? Sorry, can we open her mic?
She added a note in the chat.
Yeah.
A note in the chat says, for question number 2, sometimes movements begin at the grassroots or employee level and moves upwards.
Great, thank you so much. A very profound statement, Glenda. Thank you so much. At this time, the Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion with the Region of Durham, Hector Alexander, is going to continue with the question and answer section. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Patricia. Hello, everyone. My name is Alison. And we will move on to, there's a question for Sophie on the topic of recruitment. What tips do you have for organizations who utilize recruitment software to sort, quote unquote, sort and evaluate applications to eliminate some of the systemic barriers that you discussed? And the notion that not everyone is an expert resume writer, when such software systems are often designed to evaluate on these criteria. And the second part, should organizations be encouraged to accept hybrid application formats? And that is print in addition to online submissions. It's a long one.
Such an impactful question. I really like it. I think it's a difficult topic where I bring my own perspective into it. So I'll just answer to the best of my current knowledge, but it is changing with the state of technology that is really rapidly evolving. I would say that at this time, I don't really believe in tools that automatically sort and disqualify candidates. I have tested a lot, and the few that are accessible that I have tested are either, from my experience and what I've seen, they weren't doing a great job at promoting diverse candidates, or there are active lawsuits against some for discrimination against people of color and people with disabilities, and I think people of a certain age group. So if you fall within the three, it would be difficult to pass through that sorting system. So I think for organizations that are focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, they should actually prioritize having trained human beings doing the sorting, training on DEI, which includes disability inclusion, and just having an understanding of how that experience impacts the professional experience of someone, the academic experience of someone. And it doesn't take that long to sort through applications. I mean, at Fable, we get a significant amount of applications, and we try to still give a good amount of time on each resume for people. I think it's part of the candidate experience, but also just building a brand that has that recognition and to be able to build the best team. So I think it's really worth that investment. That said, I do think there is a potential with where AI is going currently we're not there yet. The AI is not there yet at all. There's still biases like built into it just based on how it was built. But I do think the fact that large language models being accessible for more people, there might be a potential for organizations or specific types of artificial intelligence to be trained on actual experiences of people that are from a diverse background so that the sorting can be at that level. And that's where also ethical AI comes in, where I believe there is a potential for AI to be less biased than humans if we are able to create it that way. And then the last part of the question was about hybrid application formats. I believe so. I believe that would be really great if there was just not a one-size-fits-all process for application, just like there's not a one-size-fits-all process for being an employee. And so that people who feel more comfortable with a phone call or they feel more comfortable with some sort of other format are still able to apply to a job and be able to showcase their skills in the way that works best for them.
Okay, Patricia, thank you so much. But I'm sorry, Tim. Oh.
No, this is Allison. I was just thanking Sophie for the answer and wanted to see if any other panelists wanted to add to that as well. I think, the important thing is that bias is what comes up, a lot. And so, we also think of, the folks who are actually building the AI and the bias too that we bring with them. Did any of the other panelists want to respond to the question before we moved on to an audience question?
This is Pina. I would just like to add a little bit to Sophie's point about having alternate ways of applying for jobs. Exactly. I think we have technology today that enables us to do things differently. And I think organizations, particularly because we know that the applicant tracking systems today still discriminate because they use AI, and AI is not necessarily fully inclusive, at least not at this point. So I think it's really, really important to think about different ways. We used to in the past have fairs, obviously career fairs. We still have those, and those are great opportunities for individuals to do that. But you can have mentorship kind of activities. You can also open virtual focus groups, and sort of open have an application kind of day for particular jobs where individuals come to those virtual events. And what we've done in some organizations is we've also created pools of pre-qualified individuals. So we know that these are the functional requirements that we need for particular jobs. And what we do is we put out there a call for people who have these types of functional capabilities, and we pre-qualify them so that when the time comes for onboarding, it's much more streamlined. They've already gone through those first and sometimes even second interviews, so it's easier to match them with a potential opportunity. But also the individuals also, become a little more aware of what's around them and what they're looking at as they're trying to apply for a particular position. So those pre-qualified pools are really, really helpful for both the individual, but also the managers who do want to hire persons with disabilities and then know where to look for those individuals.
Thank you, Pina. And so now we'll go to a question, Liz. You can unmute yourself, Liz, to ask your question if open your mic.
I am trying to unmute her. Liz, I've asked you to unmute yourself.
Good afternoon. Sorry about that. I do see that. I wasn't aware that I had raised my hand. I do apologize. I don't see a hand up on my screen. But while I'm here, I just say thank you all for sharing.
Thank you, Liz. And your hand is up on our screen. So maybe that's a good thing. Thank you.
Love technology.
Love technology. So we can move on to another question. There's a question: how do you get accessibility at the table with diversity and inclusion staff? There is currently a divide. The diversity staff will discuss accessibility without knowing the legislation or activities that are happening in their own organizations, but they will not invite accessibility staff to the table to bring the knowledge and experience. Did any of the panel members want to take this one?
It's Tim speaking. I'll jump in first, and then if any of my fellow panelists want to join in. I think for me, it's a really great question. And one of the challenges you have in diversity is there's always been this kind of hierarchy of diversity, right? And even within disability, there's a hierarchy of disability of which disabilities are more prominent or more needed in organizations, and that's really damaging. And so what I would say in terms of strategies is don't wait to be asked to the table. Barge into the room. And I don't mean physically knock down the door, although my chair can be used as a pretty good battering ram if it needs to be. But generally, you have to demonstrate the value of lived experience. And the way to do that is by saying, I have something to add to this project, or I have something to add to this table. But the other thing you can do that's really simple and often makes people sit there with their mouths open a little bit is say, has accessibility been considered here? And when they start to give you the answer, well, we didn't really think it needs to be because because it's not. We don't see customers with disabilities. Then push them on why that is, right? And so asking the questions and not waiting to be invited. And Glenda, I really like the point you just made in the chat about accessibility needs to be everyone's business. And you're absolutely right, Glenda. It's not only for those of us that work directly in accessibility to be asking these questions, right? The whole point of trying to create a culture of accessibility within an organization like ours, like mine, is that myself and my colleagues that work for the Accessibility Center of Excellence aren't the only ones asking these questions. So great comment there, Gwen, and I hope I did it justice.
Yeah, and I think this is Pina, and I think to add to your point, Tim, I think yes, it has to be everybody's business, and everybody has a shared role in accessibility. Whether you're hiring persons with disabilities or hiring period, or whether you're designing or developing digital properties, whether those be websites or documents, we all have a role to play. We all need to have the proper training and tools to do that. But I think one of the things that has been missing, and even if you look at the regulations, one of the things that really we haven't seen a lot of is accountability. So while we say it's everybody's, it's everybody's responsibility, but we also need accountability to make that happen. In a business environment, if someone deploys a tool that is not secure, right, that doesn't pass security, they get into a lot of trouble. But today, if something is released that it's not accessible, they don't necessarily, get in trouble. There's no and I'm not necessarily saying that we need to have penalties, but I think there's a need for more accountability for accessibility. We need to make sure that it's not just something we talk about, but it is something that we do, and that we do it right. And it's not just about numbers, but it's also about the quality and the productivity and in inclusion altogether. So I think that there's an opportunity here to Tim's point about, making sure, we strive for the C-suite, but the C-suite that exists today needs to have some accountability for accessibility, and we're lacking that. No matter where we're looking at, like I said, whether we look at government and the AODA, for instance, or whether we look in companies, we're not seeing a lot of accountability for it, and we need to raise that.
Thank you, Pina. This is Allison, and I completely agree that we cannot do diversity, equity, and inclusion work without accessibility being in the center. I'm driving this work, so completely agree. We have one other question that I'd like to share with the panel. Someone is asking if there are any. Just move that for me. Sorry. Someone was asking if there are any words up on my screen just left to be. My apologies, actually. So we'll take this one. Someone has asked, how is undue hardship determined? So we hear a lot about, undue hardship. What does that mean? How does that show up, and how is it determined? Would any of the panelists like to take this one?
I can speak a little bit on what we've done, which is still a work in progress of what we're doing, just because what undue hardship means, like a lot of legal jargon, is not much or not a lot, and it's really defined by what the organization thinks. But technically, what it means is it's not causing a significant harm to the organization to implement an accommodation. So whether that be financial or in terms of to the style of management, it shouldn't cause undue hardship. What is the level or definition of where does it become undue and where does it not is not something that is defined. And that is our work internally on the people team to define. And we're trying to make that be transparent to people, because I think this is the key part that is missing when we talk about undue hardship, which might be why some people are not asking for accommodations, because we don't know, is it too much? Can I ask for this? So I think this is sort of part of the work that organizations who have been doing good work in terms of providing accommodations should point forward. What have they done for their team, so that that is public information and we can use that to base our decisions. That is where we are right now, and trying to make it equitable is just trying to have a financial figure in mind where it would cause significant harm to the company to accommodate for that. And so far, we have never had someone who reached close to that level of hardship with their needs. And we have a very diverse team. So I think this is part of the work that has to be done, and where organizations and people like us should really be very vocal about it, just so that it's shared and it's something that is defined for people to request accommodations, and also for teams across Canada are able to really talk about it and provide accommodations. So that's such an HR answer, but I hope
it is. It is helpful. There are some guidelines that the Ontario Human Rights Code gives us as well. And in doing this work, I don't think I've come across a situation where accommodation could not be co-created to get to that point of undue hardship. So thank you for sharing that. Would anyone?
Sorry, Allison, I just want to add really quickly. It's Tim speaking. I'm going to put I have a law degree hat on and be a bit of a law nerd for a second, which is to say, it's very difficult to get to the level of undue hardship. And the reason it's not defined is because it looks different for every organization. What CIBC calls undue hardship is very different from what a small mom and pop shoe store would call undue hardship, for example, right? And so it's very, there's not a one size fits all answer here, but the important thing to remember and why I jumped in is undue hardship is not an out card, right? It's not like a get out of jail free, oh, we're going to play undue hardship now, so we don't have to accommodate you. It's not a trump card, and I hate that word because it reminds me of a person. Anyway, but it's not a trump card. And even if they start to say, this looks like undue hardship, the answer back is why, right? Because they have to give you a number and they have to show you why. And I've worked in this space for a very long time. You and I have known each other for a very long time.
Yeah.
I've not seen any organization that's not even come close to proving undue hardship, but even been in the same ballpark as undue hardship, because there's always a solution and there's always a way to get creative. And we wouldn't allow it with any other diversity group. All right. If there was undue hardship claimed on any other diversity group, it would be a media story in a heartbeat that's picked up by every single outlet. The reason that accessibility is difficult is because sometimes our accommodations cost money rather than just letting people in the door. So it's important to remember that undue hardship is not like a card that someone can play to be like, I'm putting down undue hardship, like in a poker game. It doesn't work that way. Even if they start to talk that way, ask them why, and then say, I'm willing to work with you to find a solution that works both for myself and for the organization.
And Tim, I'm so glad, this is Pina, I'm so glad you ended with that statement, because that's exactly where I was going with that, is that there's an element of conversation that has to happen. Very often it's a de-escalation kind of process, a mitigation process to sort of say, hey, I'm willing to work with you. Let's figure out a solution that works for both. And we see this a lot. I mean, good examples are things like people who want I don't know, perhaps maybe an elevator installed in a small shop that's on a second level, for example, and it's just, or it's an historical building and you can't really do that kind of thing. So, but there are ways to get around. I also think that we as a community, as a disability community, also have to be realistic. In some cases, as the example of the historical building is an example, you may not be able to have the exact height of the ramp that meets, the exact elevation that the standards require. But does it work? Can we make it work? And if we can, let's not be picky about it, right? Let's make sure that it's acceptable, because I think one of the problems we've had in this conversation of accessibility is, and this is, part of the conversation that used to happen, is that people felt they had to make things fully accessible. Well, fully accessible doesn't exist. You make it accessible as best you can, using the guidelines, using the tools that are provided to you, and having those conversations with the individuals.
Thank you so much, Pina, for sharing this. And that is work that, you know, will continue to be on the lens that will apply, and how best do we do that. And I think co-creation is so important. I always think of co-creation, like how do we do this together, you know, to ensure that, you know, we're meeting, being as inclusive as we can and being as accessible as we can, but also looking at, you know, sometimes the reality, you know, of the situation. Not that folks can use that as an excuse, but also looking at what is the reality and what we're dealing with.
Exactly.
There is another question around remote work. You know, and what kinds of accommodations are reasonable? And that's an interesting question, because I know accommodations, you know, is very, very personal, very individualized. But what sort of accommodation in general, you know, do you think are reasonable when it comes to remote work? Anyone want to jump in on this one?
I just wanted to let Sophie a chance to answer, because she probably does a lot of remote. With Fable, I believe there's a lot of remote work, right? Right, Sophie?
Yeah, exactly. But I don't want to like take all the questions, but at Fable, we're remote first, so it's part of that. But I would say if I was to guide other companies, I'm not sure if I understand the question. Is it just with remote, like with asking remote work, or in terms of if you're already remote, what can you ask for? Allison, I think you're muted.
Or reasonable, sorry, it's Allison. They're asking for reason. What would be a reasonable accommodation for remote work?
I think most things would fall within reasonable if there's something that you need to do your job better. So that's where I would define it. I can say some of the accommodations that we've put in place at Fable would be setting someone up, for example, in a shared office, because they work best close to people instead of remote, being that we are only remote or remote first. It could be some tools as well. So we have specific tools, obviously, for people to access information, technology, people with disabilities, but we also have tools where we'll utilize, for example, AI as a note-taking tool for people who have trouble following the conversation, participating in the conversation, and taking notes. We'll use tools, for example, to review documentation and things like that for people that might have difficulty with attention to details. So that could be one of those. It could be asking for an accommodated schedule. That's something that can be done. So starting at a different time, having longer pauses during the day, having more vacation time as well as something that we've accommodated. I don't know why I said vacation. It's not for vacation, but it would be for people that have medical appointments, for example, so that their work expectations are aligned to that. And my personal opinion is that sometimes accommodations goes to the point of sometimes there's a part of the job that might need to be removed from the description. I think that's part of accommodating an employee, is looking at what people are able to do. And sometimes there are some specific parts of a job that are not necessarily able to be accomplished. I would say this is rare. It's not usually the core parts of the role, but sometimes we have to adapt what our expectations are. And I think that's kind of part of an accommodation process. And those, I have a few examples in my head, but I don't want to just focus on those. But yeah, I would say that's where I would position myself, is having conversations with people on your team. There's a really great website that I can put in the chat it's a network for accommodations that just kind of recommends options for accommodations for all or most types of disabilities that we really use to inform ourselves as well.
I want to add here, it's Tim speaking. I want to add a couple things. One is that I find it really funny that for years, the disability community was asking their employers for remote work. And the answer was always, no, we can never do that. And then COVID happened. And look, the entire world went remote and the world didn't blow up. It was fine. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we've been asking for remote work for a long time. And really, for me, it's about the disability tax, right? It's about the fact, and Sophie, you mentioned some of this, It's about the fact that for a lot of people with disabilities, commutes are longer, or breaks are longer, or bathrooms are, the time it takes you to go to the bathroom are longer. And often it just makes sense to work remote. For me, on days that I have to go into the office, I'm adding essentially 90 minutes to my day each way with the commute because of Wheel-Trans, right? Which, if anyone knows Wheel-Trans or the Durham equivalent, they're not the best services. But the other thing I just want, and Glenda put in that chat, your home might be accessible as well, right? And that's a really important part. But to counterbalance that, because I want to be totally fair and honest here, we have to remember that not everyone is in Toronto with high-speed broadband internet. And so remote work can often be challenging. And we need to understand that not everyone is going to have a stable internet connection all the time. And so it's about getting creative. And, whether it's sending stuff back and forth by email or sending stuff back and forth by courier, whatever it is, even locally, we need to recognize that it can't all happen in a digital world because the digital world isn't equitable for everyone, right? And that I find living in Toronto, that point often gets forgotten. We assume that everyone has high-speed broadband and getting on a Zoom meeting or on a Microsoft Teams meeting will be no problem. And I'm very fortunate to be in that position, but a lot of people with disabilities either can't afford high-speed internet or live in situations with shared computers or live in parts of the province that aren't yet there. And so I think I just want to make that point, not to completely destroy the point I just made, but because I think it's a point that doesn't get made often enough, which is we need to think about remote outside of the digital world as well.
Yeah. Tim, those are great points. And I wanted to also sort of share a quick story. I remember piloting remote working in the bank years ago. And I remember having a conversation with certain individuals, about, trying this out and what they preferred and whatnot. And I learned at that time that not everybody wanted remote work. Even if you had a disability, not everybody wants to be working from home. And so that brings me to the point of accommodation. One of the accommodation that seems to work well when it comes to for persons with disability is that this hybrid model where people with disabilities can choose the days that they go in and the days that they stay at home. And it has been very helpful from a social integration and a mental health balance for individuals to be able to do that, because often remote work all the time can lead to isolation, can lead to you're not feeling part of the team, and you're not part of the, the corridor discussions or the water cooler discussions. And so the opportunity to leverage an accommodation by providing hybrid models has also been very, very helpful for persons with disabilities. And I think that it not only for persons with disability, but it has also been very helpful for people without disabilities to balance their own lifestyles and life requirements. So accommodations, as we said before, does not have to be expensive. Companies will provide you normally the accommodations necessary for you to do the job that they're going to hire you for if you don't have them. But the last point I do want to make, and I just, again, not to sort of rain on anyone's parade, but there are jobs that cannot be done remotely either. And I think we also have to be cognizant of that. And when you are applying for a job, you need to have that conversation early on about those types of requirements. Is this job flexible enough? Can you work remotely? Can you have a hybrid model, or et cetera, et cetera?
Thank you so much, Pina. And thank you to everyone who has joined us here today as a panelist, as an attendee. This brings us to the end of our conference. I want to thank Tim, Pina, Sophie, and Glenda for sharing your wealth of knowledge and insightfulness. It was truly an honor to listen to you. A special thank you to the planning committee members at both the Ability Center and the Region of Durham Your time, your effort into coordinating this event is truly appreciated. We hope that you take back some key learnings and apply them to your work. We hope that you have started a conversation that you want to continue with your colleagues back in the office. Lastly, we would love to hear back from you on your thoughts of this conference. It will help inform how we plan. On the screen, and it's hope it's on the screen, is a QR code that you can scan with your phone to complete a satisfaction and feedback survey right now. This survey will also be sent out to those who share their email addresses in the registration form. We would love to hear from you on future improvement, on topics and guest speakers. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day.